Very good morning. Today we are going to discuss about computer hardware and system administration. Our subject is computer hardware and system administration. In this subject, we are going to discuss about the topic system board and mass storage devices. So in the topic system board and mass storage devices, the subtopic is motherboard. So today we are going to discuss about motherboard. So what is motherboard? What is meant by motherboard, what it contains, everything we are going to discuss in this class. So our topic is system board and mass storage devices, and subtopic is motherboard. So what is meant by motherboard? A motherboard is a printed circuit board and foundation of a computer that is the biggest board in a computer chassis. It allocates power and allows communication to and between the CPU, RAM and all other computer hardware components. So we can say the motherboard is the biggest circuit board. It's also called printed circuit board. So it's also called main board, where our important components are mounted on this motherboard. Motherboard, also referred to as the MB, main board, M board, MOBO, MOBD, backplane board, base board, main circuit board, planar board, system board, or a logic board on Apple computers. So these are the different names for motherboards, but we say universally the name motherboard. It's a printed circuit board inside the computer case. The first IBM PC motherboard had only a processor and card slots. Users plugged components like floppy drive controllers and memory into the slots. A motherboard is the main circuit board inside a computer that connects the different parts of a computer together. It has sockets for the CPU, RAM, expansion cards, example discrete graphics cards, sound cards, network cards, storage cards, and etc. It is also hooks up to hard drives, disk drives, and front panel ports with cables and wires. So we can say the main important component inside the computer case is motherboard, where maximum components are mounted on it, and it a platform where we connect or mount all the devices on the motherboard. So we can see a sample motherboard here, a sample mode motherboard, where all the components to form a computer, to work with computer, are mounted here. So starting from here, we say this is called heatsink. This is called P4 power connector, which is used to give the power to the CPU. And this one is the inductor coil, and these are capacitors. And gigabit LAN header, this is a LAN header. Oscillator, this one. And this is CPU socket lever. CPU socket lever. And this is a CPU socket to insert the CPU. There is a voltage regulator. Here we can see the north bridge, one of the important component of the motherboard. And here 4-pin CPU fan connection. And this one is motherboard model name, this one. And these are the 4 slots, 4 into DIMM memory slots, 1, 2, 3 and 4. This is Super IO chip, and this is mounting screw holes. Here we see floppy connector. The older motherboards we have this. In the new motherboards we do not have this floppy controller. And this one is primary ATA IDE connector. To connect the hard disk or CD-ROM drive, we use this. And this is 24-pin motherboard power connector, so where maximum power, required power to the motherboard comes from the SMPS we connect here. And this one is a south bridge, another important component is motherboard. There is a 4 into SATA connectors. These 4 options are used to connect SATA type hard disk or SATA type DVD-ROM drives. Here also, by using this primary IDE connector, we can connect IDE type hard disk or IDE type CD-ROM drive. And here, coin cell CMOS backup battery this one. The primary and secondary at a RAID this one. And system panel connectors, these are the system panel connectors. And game MIDI header, this ATA controller chip, serial port connector, USB header this one, and SATA controller chip this one, and these are the jumper settings. And these entire are SATA writes, onboard LED, and this one 1394 controllers and 1394 headers, and these are 2 into PCI Express slots, 2 express slots are there, and CD in onboard audio integrated circuit. Here 3 PCI slots are there, and Marvell onboard wireless chipset. This one is the one of the AGB slot, and 2 into 3 pin case fan connectors, and these are the back panel IO connectors, and these all are back panel IO connectors. So this is a typical motherboard. We can say that the large circuit board inside the computer case. So we will see the details about it now. This is another motherboard. The RAM slots are there, and 3 PCI slots. This is the AGP slot, and north bridge and south bridge, and IDE connectors, and IO ports here. So this is also one of the motherboard. Another motherboard here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 PCI slots are there, and RAM slots, and this is the AGP slot, and these are the RAM slot. Is heatsink, and this is a CPU slot. So what is the purpose of system board? The primary purpose of a system board is to house the CPU and allow all devices to communicate with each other. So what is the purpose? The primary purpose of a system board is to house the CPU and allow all devices to communicate with each other. So here we can say this is the CPU, and all the components are mounted here, and all the components can communicate through this motherboard. This is the main purpose of the motherboard, where all the devices are mounted in a single place called motherboard. So communication among all the devices is possible through the motherboard only. This is the main purpose of the motherboard. So motherboard overview, we see a motherboard provides connectivity between the hardware components of a computer like the processor, CPU, memory, RAM, hard drive, and video card. There are multiple types of motherboards designed to fit different types and sizes of computers. Each type of motherboard is designed to work with specific type of processors and memory, so they are not capable of working with every processor and type of memory. However, hard drives are mostly universal and work with the majority of motherboards regardless of the type or motherboard. Because in the market there are a number of types of motherboards available, and number of processors available, and types of memories also available. To work with all the types of specifications of processors and memory, maximum motherboards are designed. But some motherboards are fit to design for a specific purpose of processors. So that's why while purchasing the motherboard, we choose what is a perfect motherboard to us. So layout of the system board we see now. So this is the layout of the system board. Just now we saw what are the original components, actual components mounted on it. So this is a layout of the system board. We can see here we have RAM connectors, as a fan power supply connectors we have, as a processor supports socket power supply connector, processor power supply connector here, and this chipset inside this heatsink fan, and motherboard power supply connector is there. These are the input output connectors, and these are the PCI extension slots, and this is the AGP slot on the motherboard, and this is the audio chip, and here drive floppy drive connectors and jumper settings are there, and this is the chipset. So this is a system layout of the system board. So what was the first motherboard? The first motherboard is considered to be one used in the IBM personal computer released in the year 1981, because the first ever personal computer was developed in the year 1980s. So that's why the first ever motherboard was inserted in the IBM personal computer released in the year 1981. At the time, IBM referred to it as a planner instead of a motherboard. So it was planner board. They were saying planner board instead of motherboard. The IBM personal computer and the motherboard inside it would set the standard for IBM compatible computer hardware going forward. So this was the first ever motherboard used in the IBM personal computer in the year 1981. Is there a motherboard in laptop, smartphone and laptop? There is a question raised. Yes, although the board is often referred to as a logic board and not a motherboard. So in the laptop, smartphone and tablet also we have boards just like motherboard, but we say this as logic boards instead of motherboards in case of laptop, smartphone and tablet. The logic board is very similar to a motherboard and operates the same way. However, because of size requirements, with most logic boards, the computer components like the processor, RAM, and tablets and smartphones are soldered onto the motherboard itself. Whereas in motherboard, in case of desktop computers, we use it to insert. We insert RAM in the RAM provided RAM slots. Processor we insert in the processor slots. Whereas in the logic board, in case of laptops and smartphones and tablets, maximum RAM and processor are soldered onto the motherboard itself. Also, because of many of these devices have no upgrade options, there are no slots or sockets like traditional computer motherboard. So there is no question of upgradation like this and different devices. So almost the motherboard devices, CPU, RAM and maximum fixed on the tablets and smartphones. So motherboard means specifically a PCB with expansion capabilities, already we said. As the name suggests, this board is often referred to as the mother of all components attached to it, which often include peripherals, interface cards, and data cards. Those data cards are sound cards, video cards, network cards, hard drives, and other forms of persistent storage. TV tuner cards providing extra USB or firewire slots, and a variety of other custom components. So if you see the features of motherboard, the features are of motherboards. The motherboard varies greatly in supporting various types of components. So because in emerging technology, the advent of technology, there are a number of supporting devices. So need to fulfill the needs of the supporting various advanced supporting devices, the motherboard also developed in such a way. Motherboard supports a single type of CPU and few types of memories. Video cards, hard disk, sound cards have to be compatible with the motherboard function properly. So once if we want to purchase or if we want to assemble a system, first we must see what type of motherboard we are going to purchase and what type of hard disk, capacity of hard disk and CPU type and RAM capacity. We must think about all these devices, whether they can fit on the purchased motherboard or not. So motherboards, cases and power supplies must be compatible to work properly together. So these are the features of motherboard. So popular Manufacturers of motherboards are Intel is a famous one in manufacturing the motherboard. After that, Asus Tech Computer Incorporation or Asus Tech, Asus is a Taiwan-based company. iOpen is a major electronics manufacturer from Taiwan that makes computers and parts for computers. iOpen is another manufacturer of motherboard. Abit, Biostar, Gigabyte, MSI. These are all popular manufacturers who are manufacturing the motherboard, different types of motherboard. Among all, the Intel is a famous one. So, history of motherboard. What was the history? Prior to the invention of the microprocessor, the digital computer consisted of multiple printed circuit boards in a card cage case with components connected by a backplane, a set of interconnected sockets. So before invention of motherboard and microprocessor, all the digital computer, all the components inside the digital computers were connected by a backplane in a set of interconnected sockets. And in very old designs, copper wires were the discrete connections between card connector pins, but printed circuit boards soon became the standard practice. Standard practice. So in old designs, copper wires were the discrete connection between the card connector pins. So by using copper wires, they were used to connect all the cards and with the connector pins. The central circuit, the central processing unit, memory, and peripherals were housed on individual printed circuit boards which were plugged into the backplane. The biggest S100 bus of the 1970 is an example of this type of backplane system. So before the invention of, before this motherboard, all the devices were connected in separately and interconnected sockets and copper wires and everything. It was very cumbersome in those days. So the ubiquitous S100 bus of the 1970 is an example of this type of backplane system. So by using backplane system, all the devices, digital components and maximum inside printed boards were connecting to the backplane to become a computer in those days. The most popular computers of the 1990s, such as the Apple II and IBM PC, had published schematic diagrams and other documentation which permitted rapid reverse engineering and third-party replacement motherboards. Usually intended for building new computers compatible with the exemplars, many motherboards offered additional performance or other features and were used to upgrade the manufacturer's original equipment. And if you go back in the year 1980s and 1990s, during the late 1980s and the early 1990s, it became economical to move an increasing number of peripheral functions onto the motherboard. In the late 1980s, personal computer motherboards began to include single ICs, also called Super I/O chips, capable of supporting a set of low-speed peripherals, keyboard, mouse, floppy disk drive, serial ports, and parallel ports. By the late 1970s, many personal computer motherboards included consumer-grade embedded audio, video, storage, and networking functions without the need for any expansion slots or expansion cards at all. Higher-end systems for 4D gaming and computer graphics typically retained only the graphics card as a separate component. Business PCs, workstations, and servers were more likely to need expansion cards, either for more robust functions or for higher speeds. The system often had fewer embedded components on the motherboard itself. Laptop and notebook computers that were developed in 1990s integrated the most common computer peripherals. This even included motherboards with no upgradable components a trend that would continue as smaller systems were introduced after the turn of the century, like the tablet computers and the notebook. Memory, processors, network controllers, power source, and storage would be integrated into the systems. So in the motherboard, generally motherboards, there is a separate circuit board on which all the central processing unit, hard disk drive components, and RAM slots, not bridge and south bridge, are mounted on it. Whereas smaller logic boards designed for a notebook and tablet computers, all are all the devices maximum are mounted on the motherboard itself because there is no upgradable facility in this. That's why all the processor, RAM, and other related devices are soldered and mounted directly on the motherboard itself. So, design of the motherboard. What is the design? A motherboard provides electrical connections by which the other components of the system communicate. Unlike a backplane, it also contains a central processing unit and hosts other subsystems and devices. The motherboard provides all the electrical connections by which other components of the system able to communicate each other. A typical desktop computer has its processor, microprocessor, main memory, and other essential components connected to the motherboard. So these devices, processor, main board, main memory, or all other essential components must be communicate with each other. Other components such as electrical storage controller for video display and sound and peripheral devices may be attached to the motherboard as plug-in cards or via cables. So this is a facility must be available on all motherboards. So internal components, microprocessor, main memory, other essential components must be connected to the motherboard and must be able to communicate with each other. At the same time, the external components like external storage, controller for video display, or sound, or peripheral devices must be attached to the motherboard as plug-and-play devices or with the cables. Because without external devices, connectivity of the external devices, there is no use of computer. The computer must communicate with all the external devices like input devices and output devices. So there must be facility on the motherboard. So all the motherboards are providing this facility either with the as in the form of plug-in cards or via cables. They can be connected via cables. In modern microcomputers, it is increasingly common to integrate some of these peripherals into the motherboard itself. So in older motherboards, there was a facility to connect external devices. To connect the external devices, there was a facility of having add-on cards. But in the most modern computers, there is a chance of there is integration of all these peripherals in the motherboard itself. So the advance of technology, the design of motherboards are like this. An important component of motherboard is that microprocessor supporting chipset, which provides supporting interfaces between the CPU and the various buses and the external components. The CPU must communicate with the external components like input and output devices, and CPU must communicate with the internal memory. So for that, there are two chipsets available in the motherboard, North Bridge and South Bridge. This chipset determines to an extent the features and capabilities of the motherboard. The design of motherboards, as you see in further, modern motherboards includes socket or slots in which one or more microprocessors may be installed. In the case of CPUs and ball grid array packages such as via C3, the CPU is directly soldered onto the motherboard. Motherboard slots into which the system's main memory is to be installed, typically in the form of DIMM, dual in memory line. Modules containing DRAM chips can be D3 or D4. A chipset which forms an interface between CPU's front side bus and main memory and peripheral buses. And non-volatile memory chips usually flash on in modern motherboards containing the system's firmware or BIOS. A clock generator which produces the system clock signal to synchronize the various components on the motherboard. Slots for expansion cards, the interface to the system via the buses supported by the chipset. Power connectors which receive electrical power from the computer power supply, that is nothing but SMPS, and distribute it to the CPU, chipset, main memory, and expansion cards. As of 2007, some graphics card, example GeForce 8 and Radeon R600, require more power than motherboard can provide, and thus dedicated connectors have been introduced to attach them directly to the power supply. So connectors for hard drive typically SATA only. So all these components, either CPU slots or CPU and main memory, that is in the form of DIMM and chipset, north bridge and south bridge chipset, non-volatile memory like ROM, and a clock generator slot for expansion slots, and power connectors, which the power is required to the CPU, chipset, main memory, and expansion cards, and separate power requirement, if any, to the graphics card, and all the connectors for hard drive, CD-ROMs, and maximum in case of SATA, all are available in the design of motherboard. While designing, all these are considered. The description of motherboard. The motherboard is mounted inside the case and is securely attached via small screws through pre-drilled holes. Motherboard contains parts to connect all of the internal components. It provides a single socket for CPU, whereas for memory, normally one or more slots are available. Generally 4 slots are available now on the motherboard. Motherboards provide ports to attach the floppy drive, hard drive, and optical drives via ribbon cables. So nowadays, this is almost obsolete. The floppy drives, hard disk drives, floppy disk drives are connected through the ribbon cables. Now the hard disk drives and optical drives are connected with the SATA cables. Motherboard carries fans and special port designed for power supply. And this is the description of the motherboard. There is a peripheral card slot in front of the motherboard using which video cards, sound cards, and other expansion cards can be connected to the motherboard. On the left side, motherboards carry a number of ports to connect the monitor, printer, mouse, keyboard, speaker, and network cables. Motherboards also provide USB ports which allow compatible devices to be connected in plug-in and plug-out fashion, for example, pen drive, digital cameras, and etc. So all the components, external peripheral cards, peripheral devices must be connected to the motherboard, and number of ports are to be available to connect the input and output devices like keyboard, mouse, printer, and monitor, and network cables and speaker must be available. And motherboards also provides USB ports in which USB compatible devices can be plugged in and plugged out at instantaneous basis. Here one of the motherboard, here where north bridge is a processor socket, is a memory, nothing but RAM slots, there's an IDE connector to connect the hard disk drive, there's a south bridge chip, there's a BIOS, and this is SATA connectivity, and these are PCS slots in yellow color, and this is the AGP slot, auxiliary graphics port, and this is the layout of the motherboard. This is another motherboard. Here we can see the RAM slots, 4 RAM slots are there, and there is a CPU socket and AGP graphics port, the power supply to the motherboard, and I/O ports available here. Now this is the same motherboard with the CPU, heatsink, fan, and here we have seen the motherboard without RAM and CPU and without heatsink. So if you see the same motherboard with the CPU, heatsink, fan, and RAM installed in it, this is the heatsink. Beneath this is a CPU, and these are the RAMs installed on this. Here we do not have RAMs here. Here RAM are installed here, and the heatsink and the CPU inside it. The large PCB motherboard may include 6 to 14 layers of fiberglass, copper connecting traces, and copper planes for power and signal isolation. So actually, we said motherboard is a PCB, printed circuit board. But how it was made? The motherboard includes 6 to 14 layers of fiberglass. The printed circuit board contains that includes 6 to 14 layers of fiberglass, and under copper connecting traces and copper planes for power and signal isolation. So additional components can be added to motherboard through its expansion slots. These may include processor socket, DIMM, ITX, HTX, that is PCI, PCIe, PCI Express, nothing but M.2 slots as well as power supply connectors. Typically, motherboards offer additional connectivity through a solid chip such as PCI, SATA, Thunderbolt, and USB, and more. CPU to RAM and PCI are generally connected through point-to-point connections such as Hypertransport HT and Quick Path Interconnect, that is QPI, or Ultra Path Interconnect, or UPI. Often choosing a motherboard determines many of the features that it will have. So when purchasing and choosing a motherboard, we must see all the facilities are available or not. So according to our need, we must purchase the required motherboard. What are the functions of motherboard here? The motherboard acts as the central backbone of a computer on which other modular parts are installed, such as the CPU, RAM, and hard disks. The motherboard also acts as a platform on which various expansion slots are available to install other devices or interfaces. The motherboard is also responsible to distribute power to the various components of computer. They are also used in the coordination of the various devices in the computer and maintain an interface among them. So the motherboard must coordinate in communicating all the devices which are connected to the motherboard and which are mounted in the motherboard. Some of the sizes of them in which motherboards are available: BTX, ATX, Mini ATX, Micro ATX, LPX, and LNX, etc. And these are the functions of the motherboard. So far we have discussed about motherboard. What is motherboard? It is a printed circuit and main board inside the computer case. So where all the important components, central processing unit, RAM slots, and RAM in the form of DIMMs, and all the components just like north bridge and south bridge, input and output ports, USB ports, and power connectors all are mounted in the motherboard. It's a main communicating device among all the devices which are connected and which are mounted in the motherboard itself. So even smartphones, tablets, and also uh, laptop computers are also having motherboard, but those motherboards are called logic boards because in the motherboards there is a facility of inserting and removing the devices like CPU, RAM, and other devices, whereas in the logic board, which are used in the tablets and smartphones and notebook computers and laptop computers, these devices, CPU, RAM, and everything, maximum components are soldered on it and permanently fixed on the motherboard itself. So motherboard acts as a central backbone of a computer on which other modular parts are installed such as CPU and RAM, and hard disk can communicate with each other. So this is all about the motherboard, and thank you.